They called her a diversity hire right before she saved their entire platoon. Chief Petty Officer Lennox Cade had heard every version of it. The careful silences when she entered a room. The questions about her qualifications that no one ever asked the men. The way First Lieutenant Greer looked at her during the mission brief at FOB Gambari, like she was a liability he'd been forced to accept. A box someone in battalion had checked without asking him first. What he didn't know was that the quiet sailor with the faded tan line on her ring finger had spent 22 months with a cultural support team attached to SEAL Team 5, operating in places where one wrong move meant everyone died. Or that the raised scar on her left forearm came from holding a door frame together with her own body while two teammates dragged wounded men to safety. They saw a problem. She saw soldiers who had no idea what kind of danger they were walking into. In 72 hours, their ignorance nearly buried them all. The Shawl Valley stretched out below Fobi Gambari like a scar across eastern Afghanistan, all dust and heat and the kind of emptiness that made you nervous because you knew it wasn't really empty. The firebase sat on high ground overlooking the valley, a cluster of HESCO barriers and plywood structures that baked under a sun that pushed temperatures past 1:15 by midday. Chief Petty Officer Lennox Cade stood outside the Combat Operations Center watching a CH-47 settle onto the landing zone, its rotor wash turning the powdered earth into a brown fog that got into everything, your eyes, your throat, the gaps in your body armor. She was 29 years old, compact at 5'6", with dark blonde hair pulled into a tight bun that had started loosening during the convoy from Jalalabad airfield. Her Navy working uniform Type A pants and tan shirt were creased from 18 hours of travel, but her boots carried the dull shine of someone who'd learned early that the details mattered. There was a stillness to her that made people look twice, not because she commanded attention, but because she seemed to be constantly reading the terrain even when standing in one place, her eyes moving in a pattern that took in angles and dead space and approaches. The viewer following this story might be in Cleveland or Carolina or halfway around the world. But if they've worn the uniform, they recognize this moment, arriving somewhere new where everyone is measuring you before you've said a word. If this story resonates, consider subscribing. These accounts matter. Captain Marcus Holt emerged from the COC, a stocky man in his late 30s with the 173rd Airborne patch on his shoulder and the deep tan of someone who'd been in country for 7 months. He approached with a tablet, his eyes flicking to her rank insignia, the anchors of a chief petty officer, before settling on her face. He explained that the company needed an intelligence specialist for the next series of mounted and dismounted patrols, and she'd be working directly with 2nd Platoon's operations. Lennox acknowledged with a single nod, her right hand unconsciously touching her left forearm where fabric covered a scar that ran wrist to elbow. The habit had formed after Nangarhar, after the night she'd wedged herself into a collapsing doorway and discovered exactly how much pain a person could absorb before the body quit. The scar was ropey and uneven, the kind that came from shrapnel and combat gauze and a surgeon who'd had to work fast. But Holt didn't see the scar. He saw a sailor assigned to augment his infantry company. And the question in his expression was clear: could she function in an environment that didn't involve computer terminals and PowerPoint slides? Lennox Cade had grown up in western Montana near Missoula, raised by a father who'd served as a Navy corpsman in Vietnam and a mother who died of cancer when Lennox was 8. Her father had taught her to read land the way other kids learn to read books, understanding how water moved through terrain, where cover existed, how to pace yourself on a 12-mile hike so you still had energy at the end. He'd been quiet about his service except for one conversation when she was 17 and considering joining the Navy. He'd told her that some people spent their lives looking for a mission, and some people just found themselves in places where the mission found them. The trick was being ready when it did. She'd enlisted at 19, scored high on the ASVAB, and selected intelligence specialist because her recruiter said it was a smart career path. For 3 years she'd worked in a secure facility at Fort Meade analyzing signals intelligence and feeling like she was suffocating in climate-controlled rooms that never changed temperature. Then in 2011 she'd heard about a new program, female service members who could deploy with special operations units to interact with local women in Afghanistan and Iraq, gathering intelligence in places where male operators couldn't go. The Cultural Support Team program had been brutally selective, designed to find women who could operate in extreme conditions alongside some of the most experienced warfighters in the military. The assessment phase had lasted 4 months. Land navigation under load, advanced combat life-saving, small unit tactics, integrated weapons training. Lennox had discovered something about herself during those months at Fort Bragg. She didn't break easily. More than that, she was good at staying calm when everything else was chaos, at making decisions when exhaustion made thinking feel impossible. Her deployment with CST-2 attached to SEAL Team 5 had been baptism by immersion. The platoon she'd worked with operated in Nangarhar and Kuna provinces, high-risk direct-action missions where intelligence drove targeting and targeting drove kinetic operations. She'd learned to read terrain at night through NAUDs, to move through compounds with a suppressed M4, to conduct sensitive site exploitation while rounds were still cooking off in adjacent buildings. The SEALs had tested her constantly at first, then gradually stopped noticing she was different because she could do the work. The mission that ended her time with the teams had come during her 4th rotation. They'd hit a compound outside Jalalabad targeting a Taliban commander who coordinated IED networks. The assault had gone wrong fast. Prepared defense, explosives rigged throughout the structure. Lennox had been pulling security on the 2nd floor when det cords started going off in sequence, support beams fracturing with sounds like rifle shots. She'd seen 2 SEALs dragging a wounded teammate toward the stairs and made her choice in the heartbeat: she had run or give them time. She'd braced herself in the doorframe, arms spread wide, her body weight holding splintering wood together while they got their man down the stairs. The explosion had thrown her into a courtyard 15 feet below, and she'd woken up at Bagram with her left arm reconstructed with titanium pins and Lieutenant Marcus Brooks sitting beside her rack telling her she'd saved 3 lives including his own. He'd put her in for a Silver Star. 6 weeks later, Brooks had been killed during a vehicle interdiction in Helmand province. Lennox had been stateside recovering when she'd gotten the news. The Silver Star recommendation had been downgraded to a Bronze Star with valor and the citation classified. Her assignment to CST-2 had been scrubbed from public record, replaced with generic language about intelligence support duties. She'd made a promise at Brooks' funeral in Arlington. She'd carry forward what he'd taught her about leadership, about taking care of people, about never asking someone to do something you wouldn't do yourself. When the Army had requested her by name for a deployment supporting infantry operations in Regional Command East, she'd said yes. 2nd Platoon had been in country for 5 months when Lennox arrived at FOB Gamberi, long enough to develop their own patterns and assumptions about how things worked. 1st Lieutenant Evan Greer was 26, West Point class of 2009, leading his first combat platoon after 3 years in garrison assignments. He had sharp features and sharper opinions, and when Captain Holt introduced Lennox during the evening briefing, Greer's expression had shifted through surprise to something that looked like irritation. He'd asked Holt whether the platoon was really expected to integrate a sailor into patrol operations at this stage of the deployment. The phrasing had been professional, but the edge underneath wasn't. He wanted to know why his platoon was getting saddled with someone who'd probably never left a computer terminal. Holt had explained that Chief Cade had operational experience in theater and her intelligence background would improve their pattern analysis and target development. Greer had nodded slowly and said he hoped that experience translated to movement under load because they operated in difficult terrain. The platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Keller, had watched this exchange with narrowed eyes. After the briefing, he'd pulled Lennox aside near the DFFI and told her straight. Greer was under pressure from the company commander to produce actionable intelligence results. The platoon's last patrol had resulted in 2 soldiers wounded by an IED, and the lieutenant had been making decisions lately that prioritized looking aggressive over being smart. Keller's message had been clear: watch yourself, stay sharp, and don't expect Greer to make things easy. The first test had arrived the following morning. Greer had announced during stand that they'd conduct a full combat load patrol to familiarize the new team member with operational procedures. 8 miles through the high ground northeast of the firebase, full kit mid-August heat. The stated purpose was integration training. The actual purpose was obvious to everyone present. See if the sailor could hack it. Lennox had checked her gear, filled her camelback, and taken her place in the patrol formation without comment. The terrain had been vicious, loose shale slopes, switchbacks that climbed 400 feet of elevation, temperatures that hit 118 by 1000 hours. She'd matched the pace, controlled her breathing, used every technique her father had taught her about endurance work. She'd watched Greer glance backward every few hundred meters, waiting for her to fall out or ask for breaks. She'd given him nothing. When they'd returned to the firebase after 7 hours, several of the younger soldiers had been heat casualties requiring IV fluids. Lennox had been red-faced and drenched, but still upright, and when Greer had asked if she needed to see the medic, she'd declined, and asked what time the next intelligence brief was scheduled. The look on his face had told her the test hadn't produced the result he wanted, but passing his test had only made things worse. That evening in the chow hall, she'd overheard Specialist Ramos, one of Greer's team leaders, telling another soldier that the lieutenant thought having a female on patrol was a political decision that would eventually get someone killed. The comment had spread through the platoon quickly. She was here because of policy, not performance, a box that needed checking regardless of capability. Staff Sergeant Keller had shut down the talk when he'd heard it, but the damage was already done. Greer had started excluding her from planning sessions, telling her he'd provide intelligence requirements after the fact. He'd assigned her to work in the COC during patrols, effectively benching her from operations. When she'd approached Captain Holt to clarify her role, he'd been sympathetic but ultimately non-committal. Greer was his platoon leader and had tactical discretion on asset employment. The message had been clear enough: figure it out yourself. She'd stood in the COC that night watching patrol routes on the digital map display, thinking about Brooks and what he would have done in her position. He'd have been patient. He'd have waited for the moment that mattered and then done what needed doing. She could do the same. Lennox sat alone in the 8x10 plywood hooch she'd been assigned, the single fluorescent tube overhead casting harsh light on bare plywood walls. It was past midnight and the firebase had gone quiet except for the diesel generator rumble and occasional radio chatter from the COC tower. She'd pulled off her boots and was examining fresh blisters on both heels, the kind that would hurt for 3 days but wouldn't stop her from moving. Pain was just information, her father had always said. It told you something was happening, but it didn't get a vote on what you did next. She pulled up a photo on her phone that she'd saved years ago. Lieutenant Brooks with the team in Jalalabad, his arm across her shoulders, both of them covered in dust and grinning like idiots after a successful hit. He'd told her once that the hardest part of leadership wasn't making decisions under fire, it was having the patience to deal with people who doubted you for reasons that had nothing to do with your actual performance. He'd said the key was never letting their doubt become your own doubt, staying focused on the mission and letting the work speak. She set the phone down and stared at the plywood ceiling, her left arm throbbing dully the way it always did when she was tired. She rubbed the scar through her sleeve, feeling the rope like tissue underneath. The doorframe in Nangarhar had been splitting apart in slow motion, wood fibers snapping like small arms fire, and she'd made her choice in the 2 seconds she'd had. Brooks and the breacher had made it down those stairs. That was what mattered. Greer didn't know any of that. He saw a chief petty officer who'd been assigned without his input, a variable that threatened his control of the platoon, a problem he needed to manage. She understood the psychology even if she didn't respect it. He was scared of failing and scared people made poor decisions. The question was whether his fear would hurt someone before he figured out she wasn't his enemy. She thought about going back to Captain Holt with a formal request, laying out the situation clearly, asking for reassignment. But that felt like quitting, and quitting meant Brooks had been wrong about her. She'd promised to carry forward what he'd taught her, to lead the way he'd led, especially when it got difficult. She closed her eyes and did the exercise her father had taught her decades ago in Montana: visualize the terrain, identify the obstacles, plan multiple solutions. Greer wanted her to fail, she wouldn't. He wanted her to react emotionally, she wouldn't. He wanted an excuse to send her back to Jalalabad. She wouldn't provide one. She'd stay ready. And when the moment came, because it always did in places like this, she'd do what needed doing. For Brooks, the mission tasking came down 2 hours after Lennox arrived at Phobgambari. Battalion intelligence had identified a pattern of Taliban movement through a valley complex 18 kilometers north of the firebase, and Brigade wanted ground truth on enemy strength and possible weapons cache locations. Captain Holt had assigned 2nd Platoon for a 3-day dismounted patrol that would push into contested terrain with limited quick reaction force support. Greer had structured the patrol as 3 squads with himself commanding from the center element. He'd assigned Lennox to 1st Squad under Staff Sergeant Keller, making it clear her role was to remain with the squad and provide intelligence assessments as needed. During the brief his tone had been professionally correct, but the emphasis on following orders precisely had been directed squarely at her. They'd inserted by Chinook at first light, landing in a dry wadi 4 kilometers from their initial checkpoint. The Shoal Valley rose around them in steep ridges covered with loose rock and scattered vegetation, terrain that channeled movement and provided perfect overwatch positions. Lennox had moved with 1st Squad, her M4 at low ready, her eyes working the high ground the way she'd been trained at Bragg and refined in Nangarhar. The first day had passed without contact. They'd reached their primary objective, a village that Signals intelligence suggested was a Taliban logistics node, and found it abandoned. Greer had ordered a defensive position on a ridgeline for the night, and the platoon had set rotating security while trying to sleep in shifts. Lennox had pulled watch with Specialist Ramos, who'd been silent for an hour before asking where she'd actually trained. She'd told him Fort Bragg and he'd asked what the selection had been like. She'd said difficult. He'd nodded and gone quiet again. The second day had started with a change in plan. Greer had received updated intelligence from battalions suggesting enemy forces were concentrated 6 kilometers farther north than originally assessed. He'd decided to extend the patrol beyond their planned route. Staff Sergeant Keller had questioned the decision on the command net, noting they'd be stretching water resupply and extending their exposure window. Greer had overridden him. They were going to develop definitive intelligence, he'd said, and make the mission count. By 1400 hours the temperature had climbed past 116 degrees. The platoon had been moving for 9 hours with minimal breaks and soldiers were showing heat stress indicators. Lennox had been monitoring the younger troops, watching for confusion and loss of coordination, the warning signs her corpsman father had drilled into her. She'd flagged 2 soldiers to Keller and he'd ordered mandatory hydration and electrolyte intake, slowing their pace. Greer had been furious. Over the radio he'd said they were behind schedule and needed to reach the next checkpoint before darkness. Keller had pushed back, telling him he had soldiers approaching heat casualty status and he wasn't going to kill his own people to meet a timeline. Greer had ordered the patrol to continue and stated that any soldier unable to maintain pace would remain with a security element. That was when Lennox had keyed her radio and reported what she'd been tracking for the past 90 minutes. They were being shadowed. She'd identified movement on the western ridge at 3 separate intervals, always maintaining relative position, always just visible enough to confirm someone was pacing their movement. The enemy knew their location and was choosing not to engage, which meant they were either conducting reconnaissance for a larger element or waiting for the platoon to move into a prepared position. Greer had demanded her evidence. She'd calmly listed the tactical indicators, dust patterns at intervals inconsistent with wind, light reflection off optics, complete absence of civilian activity in an area that should have had shepherds. Greer had told her she was seeing things that weren't there and ordered the platoon to continue movement. 20 minutes later the lead squad had crested a rise and identified the ambush in the valley below. Approximately 15 to 20 Taliban fighters in prepared positions with at least 2 PKM medium machine guns, perfectly situated to catch the platoon in enfilade fire with minimal cover and no easy withdrawal route. Greer's voice over the command net had been tight and uncertain, trying to process what he was seeing, trying to remember what the manual said about near-ambush procedures. The platoon had gone to ground on the exposed slope, taking what cover existed behind rocks and shallow terrain folds, and Lennox had watched Greer's command presence collapse as squad leaders started requesting orders that weren't coming. The Taliban initiated contact 45 seconds later, PKM fire raking the slope and forcing the platoon into terrain that provided almost no protection. Lennox had gone flat behind a boulder barely large enough to shield her torso, watching rounds impact the ground 8 inches from her position, feeling the familiar mix of adrenaline and forced calm that came from being under fire. She'd keyed her radio and heard chaos, multiple voices overlapping, squad leaders trying to coordinate, soldiers calling targets, and underneath it all Greer's voice asking Keller what they should do. Staff Sergeant Keller had taken control by default, ordering suppressive fire and attempting to organize withdrawal back over the ridgeline. But the Taliban had positioned a blocking element behind them. The fighters Lennox had identified on the western ridge, and now the platoon was caught between 2 forces with no room to maneuver. The return fire was uneven, ammunition discipline breaking down as soldiers burned through magazines trying to suppress an enemy in hardened positions. Captain Holt's voice had cut through the radio traffic demanding a situation report from Greer. The lieutenant had tried to respond, but his words had come out fragmented and uncertain. Holt had asked for Greer's tactical assessment, and there had been only silence broken by sustained gunfire and someone screaming for a combat lifesaver. Lennox had made her decision between heartbeats. She'd switched to the command frequency and identified herself to Captain Holt using her actual background. Former CST-2 attached to Naval Special Warfare, multiple direct action rotations in Nangarhar and Kunar provinces. There had been a pause, then Holt's voice had come back sharp and focused, telling her to give him her assessment. She'd taken command the way Brooks had taught her, calm, precise, no wasted words. She'd ordered Keller to consolidate 1st and 2nd squads and establish a base of fire targeting the enemy's northern flank. She'd directed 3rd Squad to move under cover of that suppression to a rocky outcrop that would provide flanking fires on the Taliban's primary position. She'd requested immediate close air support and walked the COC through their exact position using terrain association because the map grid coordinates were unreliable in this sector. The platoon had responded immediately. The paratroopers had recognized command voice when they'd heard it, and they'd executed with the precision of soldiers who finally had clear direction. Keller had organized the base of fire element and began putting accurate rounds on the Taliban position. 3rd Squad had maneuvered to the outcrop and established flanking fires that disrupted enemy coordination. Greer had been on the radio demanding to know who had given orders to his platoon, his voice climbing toward panic. Lennox had told him clear and cold to maintain his position and provide security for casualties. It hadn't been a suggestion. The A-10 Thunderbolt had arrived 18 minutes later, rolling in from the south with its GAU-8 cannon tearing up the Taliban's primary fighting position. Lennox had coordinated fires with the pilot, keeping gun runs separated from friendly positions, talking him through adjustments the way she'd done supporting SEAL operations in Nangarhar. The enemy blocking force had broken contact after the fourth gun run, retreating north into higher terrain. The valley had gone quiet except for the fading turbine whine of the A-10 banking away and the labored breathing of exhausted soldiers. Staff Sergeant Keller had moved through the squads conducting accountability, 3 wounded, none critical, no killed. Specialist Ramos had looked at Lennox like he was seeing her for the first time, and she'd met his eyes and told him to help move the casualties to the evacuation point. Captain Holt's voice had come over the command frequency asking for Chief Cade. She'd responded and he'd confirmed medical evacuation was inbound and they'd debrief when the platoon returned to base. His tone had made it clear there would be many questions. First Lieutenant Greer hadn't said a single word. The after-action review had taken place 48 hours after 2nd Platoon returned to Phoebe Gambari, conducted in the same briefing room where Lennox had first encountered Greer's skepticism. This time the room had been full. Captain Holt, the Battalion S3 operations officer, Staff Sergeant Keller, and every squad leader from the patrol. Greer had been there as well, sitting in the front row with his shoulders drawn in and his eyes fixed on the floor. Captain Holt had started by confirming what Lennox had disclosed during the firefight. She'd spent 22 months with Cultural Support Team 2 attached to SEAL Team 5, operating in some of the most dangerous terrain in Regional Command East. Her service record from that period was classified, but her awards weren't. He'd read the Bronze Star with Valor citation aloud, the incident at the compound in Nangarhar, holding structural collapse long enough for teammates to evacuate wounded, sustaining serious injuries in the process. The room had been absolutely silent. Holt had then addressed Greer directly. He'd said that effective leadership required recognizing expertise regardless of its source, and that Greer's failure to properly utilize an experienced intelligence asset had nearly resulted in multiple casualties. Greer was being reassigned to battalion staff effective immediately, removed from platoon leadership to work on targeting development, where he could learn operational planning without carrying responsibility for soldiers' lives. It wasn't punitive, Holt had emphasized, but it was necessary. Greer had stood, his face pale, and walked out without speaking. Lennox had watched him go and felt something closer to understanding than satisfaction. He'd been trained to lead by rank and procedure, and no one had prepared him for situations where competence mattered more than credentials. After the meeting, Staff Sergeant Keller had approached and asked if she'd consider staying attached to 2nd Platoon for the remainder of their rotation. They needed someone who actually understood how to operate in this environment, he'd said, and the soldiers trusted her now. Lennox had agreed. It was what Brooks would have done. 4 weeks later, she'd been on patrol with 1st Squad when Specialist Ramos had asked about Cultural Support Team selection, really asked, wanting to know if his sister, who was thinking about enlisting, could pursue that path. Lennox had explained that the CST program had ended in 2014, but that women could now serve in any military occupational specialty, including special operations. He'd nodded thoughtfully and said his sister would be good at it. That night, sitting alone in her hooch, Lennox had pulled up the photo of Brooks one more time. She'd made him a promise and she was keeping it, passing forward what she'd learned, making sure his approach to leadership continued. The Shawl Valley stretched dark beyond her window, and somewhere in those mountains other soldiers were standing watch. She'd sleep a few hours, then wake up and do it again. That was the work. That was enough.